I just want to say that, again, for the camera, I'm Robert Martinez, Deputy State Historian of New Mexico. And before I get started, Father and I were talking about Santa Teresa de Avila's dichos. And I don't have them in my talk, so we were just talking about how much we enjoy our chai and our coffee and our cookies. And she always had the greatest dichos. Those are sayings. She said, God is here among the pots and the pans. And she also said, there's a time for prayer and a time for partridge. In other words, a time to pray and a time to eat and enjoy. And what was the other one, Father?
God deliver us from gloomy saints.
God deliver us from gloomy saints. And she had such an intimate relationship with God that one time she was somewhere in the hills of Castilla la Vieja in Spain riding her donkey, and her donkey threw her off, and she landed on the ground, and she said, Lord, if this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few. So that's one of the people I'm going to talk about. It's been quite a visit for me tonight. I've been here a few times talking about various things, but I got to walk around. It was kind of nostalgic because what this allows me to do is revisit the fall of 1993 when I took a class right here at Mitchell Hall called Spanish Mysticism. And the professor was the late Dr. Joyce Rogers, an amazing woman, a third order Carmelite who taught here at UNM. And what you're going to get from me today is some reminiscing and a general overview of the course that I took from her. I was in there with some wonderful people, and in many ways that class changed my life. So look up here, the title of my talk tonight is Un Misticismo Tosco, Spanish Mysticism in the 16th and 17th centuries. What is mysticism? Spiritual union with God that is attained by contemplation. What is contemplation? Deep reflective thought and prayer. Folks, mysticism isn't strictly a Catholic or Christian concept. There are philosophies and religions in the East, Hinduism and Buddhism, which have their unique versions of prayer and mystical union with their concept of deity or God. But I remember studying Spanish mysticism and wondering, why would Catholics go over there when they can just look over here and see what the Catholic Church has as far as mysticism? So that is mysticism. Next, please. There's St. John Paul II. He said, or I'm paraphrasing, every Catholic in the future will be a contemplative, a mystic. And I think that it's incredibly important that we recognize that when we start looking at all the saints, and even people we know, maybe people in this room, there are mystics around us, okay? And that is definitely part of our tradition. So if you leave here with anything, know that we have a powerful tradition in mysticism. What is Spanish mysticism? Mysticism in its Spanish form, from Spain. And I'm going to kind of piggyback on St. John Paul II's call and say that if you're a Spanish or Hispanic Catholic, you kind of have to be a mystic when you study our Spanish Catholic history and our Spanish Catholic teachings through the centuries. So look at these images here. Very famous image of Santa Teresa de Avila, carved by Bernini in Italy. And there's an image of San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, having a mystical vision. Un misticismo tosco. Where did I get this? I borrowed this phrase from the late Father Tom Steele, who was a Jesuit priest here in Albuquerque. He coined this term, and here's how he defined it. A rough-hewn spirituality of ceremony and prayer that brought men and women wonderfully close to God. An incarnate God who shared with them the pain and wonder of being human, vulnerable, and mortal. He actually was talking about New Mexico when he wrote this. And we're going to see over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to tie what we see happening in Spain right here in New Mexico. Okay? Fray Angelico Chavez, he's a Franciscan priest of New Mexico who definitely influenced our history, our passion for New Mexico history and genealogy. He was also a wonderful writer, and one of the best books he wrote that has somewhat of a mystical quality was My Penitente Land. It's not so much a history as much as it is a love poem to New Mexico, about New Mexico, for New Mexicans, whether you're a native or from somewhere else. Okay? I recommend you read that book, My Penitente Land. But here's a word he had in there that helps us to understand this misticismo tosco, this rough-hewn mysticism that we find in places like New Mexico, Mexico, and central Spain. It's a Hebrew word, hesed. God in love with us. Hesed is our response to God's love, made with the help of a finite share of God's own infinite love. With this hesed, we can love God as He deserves and love one another as Christ commands us. And furthermore, hesed is a Jewish, Christian, and Muslim experience. It is Palestinian, Spanish, and New Mexican. I'm going to start with a guy from Mallorca, Spain, Ramon Llull. He's fascinating to me because you'll see of all the things he accomplished, but also because of how human he was and all of his human frailties that come to us even through his mysticism. And I think that's very Spanish. My wife, Janice Martinez, is a student of Spanish mysticism, of Catholicism in general, and she argued with me that Ramon Llull is not an essentially Spanish mystic, but I think he is, because even though he's from Mallorca, Mallorca is an island off the coast of eastern Spain in the Mediterranean, very Catalan, okay? I hope you all have been hearing about Catalonia attempting to extract itself from Spain. That's a topic for another evening. But this guy, Ramon Llull, was a mystic and a proto-mystic that would eventually foreshadow and lead to the great mystic movement of the 16th century in Spain. His origins, he was born in 1233, more or less, in Mallorca. His parents were middle class from Barcelona, the city of Catalonia. They moved to Mallorca, which had been Muslim for centuries. During that Reconquista, or reconquest of Spain by Catholics of the Muslims, the family had moved and inherited from Barcelona to Mallorca Catholic and Muslim worlds. Their father married, he married Bianca Picani, and they had children. He also fell in love with a young unmarried maiden while married in Mallorca. He pursued this woman and even rode his horse into the church in Palma de Mallorca to woo her. And she actually said, "Okay, I'll meet you. I'll meet you." And they met secretly. And when she revealed to him that her body was being consumed by leprosy, he converted. She ended up dying, and he had a major conversion, which were precipitated by 5 mystical visions of Christ. Why is he important? There's a lot of reasons, and I can't get into all of them. He's called the Doctor Illuminatus, the illuminator, enlightened doctor. He was a great, voracious writer of poetry. He made pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela and Montserrat, those great pilgrim cities of Spain. He was determined to convert Muslims to Christianity. He wrote in the vernacular, this is the 1200s, in Catalan, but he also knew that he had to learn Latin and Arabic if he was going to get his ideas across. He wrote more than 200 books. he was significant in the 1200s of helping to identify the true nature of the Virgin Mary. He wrote treatises on the Immaculate Conception, on the Assumption. He used rational persuasion to convert Muslims and Jews. He traveled all over the Mediterranean, Carthage, Tunis, Cyprus. He went there to debate the superiority of Catholicism over any other faith. He was in Paris and Rome. He pleaded with the Pope for a crusade, not of violence, but of intellect, to convert those non-believers. And his nickname was the Apostle of Africa, for having gone to Africa to convert non-believers. He established a monastery and language school at Miramar in Majorca, and he spent 10 years studying Arabic. He trained 13 monks, and his masterwork was the Ars Magna, the ultimate general art, in 1305, the purpose of which was to prove the undeniable truths of Christianity beyond reason. My gosh, I'm exhausted just talking about all the things this guy did, and this is not everything, but I'll tell you, he also got into trouble because he was so manically driven by his passion to convert Muslims and Jews that he actually neglected his family. So much so that his wife had to appoint an executor to watch over the family estate because he was off doing these things. It seemed nothing could stop him. I always found this fascinating. He created this diagram of circles and geometric figures with different words that is kind of like a proto-computer. I don't know how it works. I don't think like this. This guy had this so that you could move parts around and come up with different arguments, different explanations of the Catholic faith to essentially convert Muslims and Jews away from their belief system. I don't get it, but I'm fascinated that he was able to do this. He was an amazing thinker. He was a fantastic mathematician. Clearly, he was a very talented individual. My wife and I were in Mallorca, Palma de Mallorca, in 2011. I was doing research, so we got to go see where he's buried. There's arguments for and against his sainthood. They've at some point they started the process of sainting him, but it has not happened yet. And boy, there are arguments in Mallorca about who's better, him or Junipero Serra, and it could get quite heated at times. Let's look at a couple of his theological or mystical works. I'm just going to give you a taste because we got to get moving to some other mystics, okay? But this is the book of the lover and the beloved. And here's a quote. The lover cried aloud to all men and said, "Love bids you ever love, in buying and selling, in weeping and laughing, in speech and in silence, in gain and in loss. In short, in whatsoever you do, for this is love's commandment." But if you haven't studied mysticism or Spanish mysticism, you should. It's very much a love poem between the mystic and our Lord and God, and it can be almost sensual at times. I mean, these are love poems that show us how to be in love with God. And it's actually quite amazing. It's not, it's not what sometimes we think it's supposed to be. A father was talking to me earlier about Santa Teresa de Avila, and you said, what about a happy, what you were saying, that she was a happy saint? Or?
Yeah, she was always happy. In spite of the great pain she lived in,
she
and
suffered,
the challenges she had.
Yeah, but you see that in these writings, and there's that, like from the Old Testament, is it the Song of Songs?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's similar to that. You'll see there's always a lover and a beloved, and the beloved is God. The lover is Ramon Llull speaking, and this book here, the book of the lover and the beloved, that is a love poem to God. This is a man who is letting go, and with all due respect, letting it all hang out spiritually, okay? Let's see what's next. Art of Contemplation. This is another book, and it's what it sounds like. It's quite fascinating, this story he comes up with. He creates a character, Blanciana, I believe. We'll see the name in the next quote. The character is a pope. And the pope leaves the papacy, resigns, blesses his successor, and goes off to be a hermit to reach divine union with God. Okay? So one book, The Art of the Lover and the Beloved, is this love poem. This is a book about how to enter into such a relationship with God. So high and excellent is our sovereign good. And back then, when you see the word good in Spanish, bueno, it didn't just mean good, it meant God. Okay? There were many words for God in the language back then, but bueno, good, is God. And so low is man through his guilt and sins that oftentimes it befalls a hermit. There's your pope resigning and going to be a hermit. Or a holy man to be greatly impeded in lifting up his soul to contemplate God. And since an art or method in this business is of great help, Blanquerna, there's the name, fell to considering how he might make an art of contemplation. Because he followed an art in his contemplation, did Blanquerna so abound in the contemplation of his beloved that his eyes were ever in tears and his soul was filled with devotion, contrition, and love. You'll see these with mystics. Sometimes the priests can't even finish the Mass because they're so divinely connected to God. Santa Teresa de Avila is next, okay? That's an image of her. And we need to know this about her. She is, many consider, the foremost Spanish mystic, okay? He was in the 1200s, Ramonul. Now we're jumping to the 1500s. And keep in mind the historical context, okay? I'm actually going to read to you, if I may, just a paragraph from the paper I wrote for my class in 1993. Do not laugh, okay? This is a paper I wrote called Santa Teresa de Jesus on the nature of the devil in the interior castle, which is one of her works we'll learn about. I'm just going to read you to give you the historical context. Santa Teresa de Jesus was born Teresa de Sánchez y Cepeda in Ávila, in Castilla la Vieja, Old Castile, in the year 1515. She was at the forefront of the Spanish mystical movement in the 16th century. Her writings, such as The Way of Perfection and The Interior Castle, reveal a great deal about methods of prayer and conversion in the search for complete unification with God. Operating within the time-honored traditions of the Catholic Church, and sometimes bordering on challenging those traditions, Teresa opened new avenues toward church reform, and along with San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, blazed a trail in Spain toward a better understanding of the national religion, Roman Catholicism. This Roman Catholicism assumed a new guise as Spanish Catholicism when the Catholic kings revived the old institution of the Church, the Inquisition, in the preceding century. With Spanish nationalism on the rise and the Protestant Reformation on the horizon, the 1500s were turbulent times not only for the Church, but Spanish society as a whole. The discovery of the New World, where we are, to the west, and new people in those lands, opened up Spain's borders to opportunity as well as controversy. For Spain ultimately found itself debating on theological as political and moral grounds its newfound status as a world power and leader of the Church. These were the times in which Teresa was born and lived. She was born in Ávila, Spain, 1515. Teresa de Sánchez y Cepeda. She was at the forefront of a Spanish mystical movement, and she also had converso origins. That means she had a grandfather who had converted from Judaism to Catholicism. And that's where she was from. Those walls were constructed in the times of Ramon Llull, when you had the Moorish wars in Spain. This was to protect the city from those Muslim Moors who had been occupying that area for 500 years. And there's a... Not yet. There's, not yet. There's a pious legend that she and her brother would freak her parents out because they would run outside of those walls out to the llano, the plains, and they would go and they'd kneel down and pray, hoping to be martyred. Imagine if kids did that today. Do your kids do that today? No, they don't. Good. But these are the times she lived in, okay? Now, she was a doer. This is what me and Father were talking about. From a young age, she was very sick. She was sick all the time. But boy, she did not let it stop her. She entered the Carmelites, and at that time, the Carmelites were a very worldly organization. I mean, I'm not saying all the nuns there were worldly. There were obviously good nuns, but a lot of times those monasteries and convents were where wealthy people put their children that they could not marry off into good families. In other words, these weren't necessarily people that were called to a vocation, okay? And what a lot of these monasteries and convents became were social places where beautiful nuns would go and talk to good-looking dons and good-looking noblemen, and they'd eat cake and drink chocolate brought from the New World, and it wasn't a very spiritual place. And she entered into this world because she came from a very well-to-do family. They were originally from Toledo, Converso family, and they moved north to Avila. And this is what happened with her. But she had a mystical conversion, even with her illness, and she ended up establishing many monasteries and convents throughout Spain. And she reformed her order and created the Descalced Carmelites. Those are barefoot Carmelites. Before they used to wear nice shoes. But they went barefoot, and they were a very disciplined order, and her whole goal was to have an order of contemplatives, okay? She had mystical visions and locutions. She wrote, these are three major works of hers. It sounds better in Spanish, I think. Life. Vida. This was her life that her superior told her. We want you to write for your superiors your life story to show us how you got where you are, so we can have an idea of how you came to have these mystical visions. So that's her vida, the way of perfection. This was the guidebook for her nuns on how to achieve divine union with God, mystical union. Divine union, the way of perfection. Interior castle. The central idea of her interior castle was that you had to enter into yourself in order to find God and find that union. And that there are many rooms inside us. Morada is what it was called. It wasn't called castillo. That's just the translation. But it's fascinating to me that in Spanish it was called moradas. Because that's what the penitente chapels are in New Mexico. Morada. And I have to bring up the Spanish Inquisition because we'll see that a lot of her visions and locutions and her writings, they were controversial at the time. Now she's Saint Santa Teresa, Saint Teresa, but back then, they were wondering, her superiors and church officials, the Archbishop of Toledo, they were wondering why she was having these divine visions and why so many of them were demonic. So at one point, her writings were brought before the Inquisition. She had to keep resubmitting her vida because they kept censoring it. She had a lot of struggles, and at one point, they were going to perform an exorcism on her, because they thought, why is she having these visions? She had visions of hell. It scares the heck out of me, because in one of her writings she says that she was shown her place in hell if she did not stay on the right path. And I'm like, dear Lord, I'm nowhere near being Santa Teresa. But she saw images of souls being tossed around by demons on pitchforks. Really strange things. So yes, the Inquisition came after her, and the exorcism was actually put aside by the Archbishop of Toledo when he determined that her visions were not of demonic origin. I'm going to read, it wouldn't be fair if I didn't read some of her stuff in Spanish, okay? So if you don't understand, I have it in English afterwards, okay? From Obras Completas, one of her works, que como decía un gran letrado, que el demonio es un gran pintor, y si le mostrase muy al vivo una imagen del Señor, que no le pesaría para con ella avivar la devoción y hacer el demonio guerra con sus mismas maldades, que aunque un pintor sea muy malo, no por eso ha de dejar de reverenciar la imagen que hace si es de todo nuestro bien. This is just a little bit of it. As a learned man said, the devil is a great painter, and that if the devil were to show him a living image of the Lord, he would not be grieved, but allow the image to awaken his devotion, and that he would thereby wage war on the devil with that evil one's own wickedness. In other words, the devil, she has this thing going on in her writings, that the devil, on the one hand, she saw horrible images of the devil, but on the other hand, she said he comes as an angel of light. And that even the devil will try to deceive you by showing you an image of God. But that, if he does, just take that image and put it right back in the devil's face and condemn him, convict him. She said that the devil will say words very clearly so that there will be certitude about their meaning, as is so with those coming from the Spirit of truth. In other words, devils and demons will tell us the truth, but also tell us lies and mix them to confuse us. And so you have to be in a sense of always in prayer, okay? I want to say something real quick because it's coming to me. It's not in my presentation, but it's from my readings. She was obviously under suspicion from the Inquisition, a lot of times because of her writings, but also because of her Jewish background, but also because of a movement called the Alumbrados. Alumbrados, which starts in the late 1400s. These are alumbrar, illuminated. I'm almost getting a little dangerous saying Illuminati, but it's not the same, okay? But these were people in Spain, often women, who preached the doctrine that said they knew how to achieve divine union, a total connection with God, so much so that there was no need for priests. Don't get mad at me, this is what they taught. There's no need for a church, that the sacraments were useless, and that if you're in this divine state, you could even commit mortal sin and it would be okay. Clearly you could see the heretical aspect of this. So I'm just telling you that because there were certainly times when the Inquisition looked at Santa Teresa and wondered if she was maybe falling into that heresy of the Alumbrados.
Where did they get these beliefs from? Because it sounds like Gnosticism.
That's what it was.
Okay.
That's what it was.
Okay.
That's where they got it. It shows up first around 1498, and it carries through simultaneously with the mysticism movement. And some people think it might have been brought from Italy, and then from there, probably the Middle East. So yeah, very good point.
Yeah.
It is certainly Gnostic in its roots and origins.
Do we know if there was anything like going back and forth with the Albigensians and these groups in Spain?
There seems to be a similarity. Obviously, the Albigensians are before,
right,
about 200 years before. So there's always a possibility that there's a remnant because they share a border right there. You know, and even though technically the Albigensians, the Cathars were eliminated in the 1200s, there's still the possibility that there's some of that running around. But you know, what you have in Spain in the 1400s with the establishment of the Inquisition, and then you have these Spanish, it's strange, these saints. Spain is producing so many saints in the 1500s. It's no wonder that Spain actually was, in a sense, immune to the Protestant Reformation that spread through Northern Europe, because Spain, in a sense, cleaned house about a generation before. All right? But I just wanted to throw that in there because it made me think when I was thinking about her being investigated by the Inquisition. And there's a famous statue of her by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, Ecstasy of Santa Teresa, 1652. That's in Rome. Every time I go to Rome, I always get distracted, and I've yet to see this statue in person.
It's in a tiny church.
Yeah, I want to see it. Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Oh, I want to see. How big is it? Is it?
Oh, it's life size.
Oh, it's life size.
But the church is a very humble little parish church.
Yeah.
And it's on a side altar. It's not at all where I thought it would be.
Well, this is, someday I will see it, because if you see, that's Santa Teresa entering into ecstasy with God, and there's an angel piercing her heart.
The golden arrow.
Yes, and there's her flowing gowns and her foot without shoes. But they also say she was a beautiful woman who had beautiful feet that she was somewhat proud of. And they say that when she entered her order, there was a gentleman looking at her and looking at her feet. And she said something like, "Get a good look, because it's the last time you're ever going to see it." And she went off to be a contemplative, you know. So I love these Spanish saints. They're so human, you know, because they are. They were and they are. San Juan de la Cruz. I love this guy. My wife and I have a mini debate going on. So I said, Santa Teresa, she's the Spanish mystic of all Spanish mystics. And my wife says, maybe, but San Juan de la Cruz. San Juan de la Cruz. Let's learn about this guy. I love this guy. St. John of the Cross. There he is. Again, another image of him in divine union with our Lord. He's born in 1542, so he's roughly 20-some years younger than Santa Teresa. Juan de Yepes y Alvarez. Unlike Santa Teresa, he is of humble origins. His father was from a well-to-do family that sold silk. But when they were going through a town, father fell in love with a woman of lower means. They were weavers, and they fell in love, and he married her, and the parents disinherited him. So he had to live the life of a pauper. So he comes from humble origins, a poor guy. He worked at Medina del Campo as a male nurse in a pauper's hospital. His mom had to put him in a poor school where they educated him probably in Christian doctrine, reading and writing. He was a poor guy. They provided poor little guy, and they provided food, lodging, and education. But then they noticed he was a pretty sharp guy, so they put him with the Jesuits. And you can imagine how that turned out. He got really educated in rhetoric, Greek, Latin, and he eventually took vows as a Carmelite, much to the chagrin of the Jesuits, because they wanted him. But he wanted to join a contemplative order, okay? And he was a very quiet guy, it seems, very shy. He attended the Universidad de Salamanca, that's the famous university at Salamanca, and he was there when Fray Luis de Leon was there, and all these heavy hitters. So there was Juan de Yepes y Alvarez attending the University of Salamanca, and he eventually meets Santa Teresa. He wants to become a Carthusian. Is that how you say it? Carthusian? Yeah. He wanted to join them and be a contemplative, and then Santa Teresa got her hands on him. All right? And she said, well, you know what? I'm establishing convents all over the place, and I'm thinking, I'd like to do the same thing for friars, for men. And you seem to be the guy to do it. And then he says, well, fine, but I'm not waiting a long time. We do this now or forget it. And she liked that about him. So they traveled around, and he helped her. In other words, they both co-founded and helped reform the church. But you know what? If you think people would just throw them a ticker tape parade, right? And that's not what happened. They threw him in jail. They threw Fray Juan de Yepes, he was jailed in Toledo for attempting to reform his order. And it was after that experience he escaped. Some say he had divine help in his escape from prison in Toledo. But after that experience, he produced The Dark Night of the Soul. That's his masterpiece. I just have a quote here. On a dark night, inflamed with love's desires, oh sweet happiness, I went forth unnoticed when my house was already asleep. You can see him getting this consolation while he's in jail. Most people would be somewhat desperate, right? But not John. He's in there composing in his mind and in his heart and in his soul that dark night of the soul. And what it is it's a lesson for all of us about what the closer you get to God, God sometimes withdraws and you feel that dryness. Where are you? Are you even there? Well, that's the dark night of the soul. God calling us into a deeper union with Him. He had a mystical vision, many of them, but this is a fascinating one. I've seen this original. If you go to the monastery right outside the walls of Avila, you see where he and Teresa lived and talked, and it's quite fascinating. But he had this image, which may not seem like a big deal to us, but back then it was an interesting way of looking at Christ crucified, looking down at an angle with his Christ's arms and back twisted from pain and the weight of his body. You see drops of sweat, the body contorted. You can feel the agony and the pain, the nails driven into the hands to keep the body tied to the cross. But the Christ dying of asphyxiation, can't breathe. And you just get this feeling of Christ's agony. And it was such an amazing image that some 400 years later, Salvador Dali painted his own version, inspired by St. John of the Cross, Christ of St. John of the Cross. And there you see the image from above with the body contorted. I love this image. And I love the union of St. John of the Cross with this weird artist, Salvador Dali, who usually paints the weirdest things. But look at this. It's like a traditional image, somewhat, even for Salvador Dali.
Who produced the original drawing? Was it St. John of the Cross?
St. John of the Cross.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry.
No, that's all right.
San Juan de la Cruz and Santa Teresa, they became great friends. San Juan was Santa Teresa's confessor. They were said to levitate during their conversations. They would have conversations with the grill between them. That was very common for Carmelite nuns. We have Carmelite nuns right here in Santa Fe. And they were said to levitate when they were talking. She called him my little Seneca because he was under 5 feet tall. And Seneca, of course, was that great philosopher from Spain who was Nero's tutor, who in his day was quite an amazing person himself. In Spain, in parts of Spain, the word Seneca means wisdom. And it's because he wrote about all kinds of things. He said things like, talk to men as if God could hear you. Live with men as if God could see you. Something. Talk to God as if men could hear you. Live with men as if God could see you. He had this amazing grasp, Seneca did, foreshadowing Christian doctrine. But she called him my little Seneca, and she called him half a friar. He's a little friend. And they even have his little chair there, and it's little when you go see him. There's a painting I found of them having a conversation. She's levitating, he's in his chair levitating, and there's the Holy Trinity in their divine glory. Cool, huh? Okay. We're on time. I like this lady. I tend to like the ones that haven't been sainted yet, because they just aren't quite there yet, at least with the church, you know what I mean? This is Maria de Jesus de Ágreda. She comes after Santa Teresa and after San Juan, okay? Those two are in the 1500s, okay? She dies first, Santa Teresa, she's older, and then about 13 years later, San Juan dies. And now we're getting to the 1600s. Maria de Jesus de Ágreda, she's born in 1602 in Ágreda, Spain. This is also Old Castile, Castilla la Vieja, and this little town borders with Aragon, up just a little north and a little east of Madrid, if you've ever been to Spain. Her name is Maria Coronel y Arana, and she was also of Converso, or Jewish ancestry. At age 12, she entered the Descalced Carmelite convent, and had mystical visions as a youth. So she's very famous for this work. She had mystical visions of God, of Jesus appearing before her. She also had Our Lady appear before her, and she wrote The Mystical City of God. It was 8 books or 6 volumes, and it deals with many themes. It was dictated to her by the Virgin Mary, and the concepts include Mary and the Triune God, terrestrial and heavenly life, and issues dealing with the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption, Michael the Archangel, Gabriel, the childhood of Jesus. It's quite a fascinating work. I remember I had part of it when I purchased from 10 Books many years ago. It's quite an interesting read. But she's written a lot of different things, but this is what she's known for, the mystical city of God. And she also came under scrutiny by the Inquisition for such writings, to be claiming that Mary's appearing to you and dictating her autobiography is quite a thing to behold. So they investigated her. There's an image I found of Mary saying, "Write that down. Write it down now." She has Our Lady saying, "This is my story, please write it and tell everyone." But what she's also known for is that she bilocated to New Mexico while she was alive. Okay? The story is that between 1620 and 1623, Maria claimed that with the aid of angels, that she went to what's now New Mexico and Texas, to the Humanos Indians, while her body remained in Agreda, Spain. She didn't name New Mexico, she just described the land and the people she was talking to. Simultaneously, Humanos Indians started to show up at the Salinas missions asking to be baptized. Do you all know where Salinas is? It's just over the mountains. If you go south and over the mountains, there's Abo and Quaray, there's mission. If you get a chance, go out there. There's beautiful mission churches from the 1600s. They're ruins, but they're massive and they're huge, and they give you an idea of what these Franciscans were up to, okay? It's quite fascinating. Well, these Indians were showing up, asking to be baptized. Fray Alonso de Benavides was the head of the Franciscans here, and he started to ask in the 1620s, why were you here? Why are you coming and asking to be baptized? Usually the Franciscans have to go out to them and gather them up and try to get them baptized and indoctrinate them, right? Well, they said that a lady in blue told them to come to be baptized. Remember, this guy, Fray Alonso de Benavides, he was the head of the Inquisition in New Mexico. So it was his job to investigate any strange occurrences, any strange behavior. So, there was another priest, Fray Esteban de Perea, down at Isleta, just south of here, who had brought word from Spain to Benavides, asking if a nun had appeared in the area. In other words, he had heard stories in Spain that Maria was claiming to bilocate here. So they started to put 2 and 2 together. They talked to these Humanos, and they pointed to an image that they had of nuns painted wearing blue. And they said, that's her. Not her, but that's what she's dressed in. She's in blue, and they said that she looks like that, but that she's young and beautiful. So this is the other interesting aspect of Maria de Jesus de Agreda, Sor Maria de Jesus, is that she supposedly had this mystical bilocation and helped get some of the Native Americans baptized. I put a question mark because it's still being investigated, even all these centuries later. There's a movement right here in our archdiocese to get her sainted. So they're looking at all these different pieces of evidence, and they look at her mystical writings, and I think they're still looking at it. Yes?
I may have missed this, so sorry, but are her writings available?
Yes.
They are?
Yes.
Okay.
I bought a version from 10 Books about 20 years ago. So you could get them, yes. And there's an image I found of her appearing with the crucifix and the angels painted and the native people listening to her. We'll see. We'll see, right? Yes, ma'am.
Are her writings one of those things that the church says, we're not going to say you can't believe it, but we're not going to say that it happened? Or
Well, technically,
Private revelation.
they're private revelation. Technically, I don't want to get in trouble here. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but really, you don't have to believe anything a saint writes to get to heaven, okay? But obviously there are writings that the church says this is divinely inspired or this isn't. So they're still looking at her cause all these centuries later. But you can buy them and read them.
Yeah.
There's no problem.
And they have an imprimatur.
Yeah, they have them in imprimatur, which means the church has said this is good.
okay.
All right? Okay, let's get to New Mexico. I'm going to touch on some points before I wrap up. Un misticismo tosco, New Mexico mysticism. I'm going to just touch on some aspects of our own 400-year-old Catholic tradition in New Mexico that might have some aspects of mysticism. And these are not necessarily uniquely New Mexican things. These are the hermanos penitentes that we have in New Mexico, the penitente brotherhood, a lay brotherhood that helps people in towns, and they recreate the Passion of Christ during Holy Week. There's a penitente morada. There's that word. That was the name of Santa Teresa's title for her interior castle. And that's in Abiquiu, New Mexico, and it has the three crosses, the Calvario. And there's an image from the late 1800s of penitentes in New Mexico. They're whipping themselves, chanting and singing, and they're carrying wooden crosses to go to the Calvario or Calvary. Un misticismo tosco, alabados and alabanzas. These are hymns that are ancient. They come down to us oral tradition from generation to generation, and if you listen to them, they have hints of Old Christian, Mozarab. These are Christians living under Arab rule in medieval Spain. They have elements of Judaism you can hear in the melodies. You can hear Moorish. And then they're brought to the Americas. And when they come here, they've been here for centuries. So you could even hear Comanche, Genízaro, Pueblo sounds. I'll sing a little bit of an alabado for you, okay? And it just goes like this. Listen. Adiós acompañamiento, donde me estaban velando, ya se llegó la hora y tiempo, ya se llegó mi partida. These penitentes would chant these in unison. And they weren't necessarily opera singers, but you could hear that mysticism in their voice. You know, when my dad died about 4 years ago here in Albuquerque, they had his mass, funeral mass, and at Our Lady of Assumption, but we also had a rosary for him. So the penitentes from where he's from in northern New Mexico, Mora, they came down all the way from Mora, and they chanted the whole rosary with their cross on the marble floor. And I remember Janice, after they were done, saying, "Now that's prayer." That's an aspect of our mysticism here in New Mexico. That's it's okay. That's Mora, where my dad's from. That's from the 1890s. There's a procession. Those are the Carmelites. Look, we're talking about Carmelites in Spain. Well, there they are in Mora. The Carmelite nuns carrying an image of the patron of Mora, Santa Gertrudes, for her feast. Yes, sir.
The penitentes, were they generally laity, or were these actually priests?
Totally laity.
Okay.
They're just laity. They came about in the early 1800s. There's a lot of ideas that in New Mexico there were no priests. There were always priests here. There may have been a shortage sometimes, but there's always been priests. But these guys came about. The idea of penitentes are medieval. You can find them in Spain and parts of Mexico. In the Philippines they have them. Well, they were brought here in the early 1800s, first to what we now call Santa Cruz up near Española. That's where they were. Then you see them around the Santuario, which also comes about in that early 1800s period. So a lot of what we consider New Mexico Catholicism doesn't always go back to the late 1500s or 1600s. It's the early 1800s. So this kind of song is brought from a town like Durango, Mexico, where you have a lot of these practices, and they're brought by priests and colonists coming up here and teaching the people here to do these things. Santos y Santeros. That's an image of Nazareno, Jesus the Nazarene. Obviously he's been flogged and he's holding the weapons and the means of torture that were used on him. This is typical of Santeros. These are saint carvers of New Mexico, and I think it's an aspect of our New Mexico mysticism to carve saints. Just like in the East, you experts about the icons, right? You have the icons are not just paintings, they're beautiful and they're wonderful, but they're also scripture. They're scripture, they're loaded with meaning, they're loaded with sanctity. And in New Mexico, you have the same thing with the santos, the retablos. Those are the flat images, similar to what you have over here. And but these are very Renaissance, beautiful images. The ones in New Mexico are kind of medieval and two-dimensional because these were not Michelangelo painting over here, okay, or Raphael. These were local people painting the Word of God onto a piece of wood. So that is also part of our mystical tradition that dates from the early 1800s, but is inspired by the previous centuries and by our roots in Spain and in Mexico. Okay? Any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, sorry, I'm covering you. But
That's okay.
so like you ended with a lot of this dates back to Spain. Is most of this? Can any of this be traced in other European Catholic countries, or is it primarily Spain would be the source for a lot of this?
Well, I guess for New Mexico, you have to trace it through Mexico, because nothing comes to New Mexico directly from Spain or any other part of Europe. And we're talking pre-United States, okay? I'm talking like before 1846, let's say. So you have a lot of stuff coming from Spain. Remember, this was part of a world empire. Spain had a world empire starting in 1492, and it first starts to crumble in the 1820s when we become Mexico. Mexico gets her independence, and then it really goes away when the United States goes to war with Spain in 1898 and takes Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, Guam. So the short answer is, I would have to say that mainly it's Spanish. But even in Spain, you have influences coming from the Cluny order in the 1100s. Do you see what I'm saying? So Spain isn't necessarily an island. There's influences coming from all over the place. And remember, Spain is the most Catholic, with the Catholic kings in the 1400s and the early 1500s. But Spain's roots, that's what I love about Spanish history. Her Catholic roots are heretical. It's Arianism that first comes into Spain with the Visigoths. That heresy that said something like, Christ isn't totally God, he's kind of God, he's part God, but not totally God. Well, it's during that Visigothic period in the 400s and 500s that Spain changes into being a Orthodox Catholic place. I say place because there's no nation yet of Spain, but there's got to be influences coming in from France, definitely, Italy, of course, and Spain's world empire. It didn't just influence the places she was at. She was influenced. The conquerors don't just change the conquered. They get changed by the conquered too. Do you see what I'm saying? So Spain was in the Low Countries. Spain was in Italy. So yeah, I don't think you can discount influences from other places. I mean, even today there are penitentes in Spain if you go there for Holy Week.
Well, that was a question I was going to, for the penitentes, is there a version of that in other European countries, or is that something you source just to Spain?
Spain has it, but I think you could find something
Poland.
similar.
You
Sure.
find it in Poland,
Poland?
still, in Krakow. They're still very big in Poland. But I think most other countries, it's disappeared under secularism.
Yeah, that's part of it because of secularism. Spain has hung out onto things. Another excellent example, non-religious, is bullfighting. Bullfighting is an ancient ritual that the ancient Greeks did throughout the Mediterranean, and it just stuck in Spain. And it eventually went away in other parts, but you could still find bullfighting in Spain. Yeah.
Could you go over a little bit for them, Bishop Lamy and the Benedictines, why there was a conflict?
Well, New Mexico during the Spanish colonial period and Mexican period, we were governed as through the church from Durango, Mexico. That was the diocese that we were a part of, okay? We tried to be our own diocese at various times, but it didn't happen, okay? So when we become part of the United States, things shift. That's when we become a diocese. And Bishop Lamy, who was from France, right outside Toulouse, he was our first bishop. And he brings a different kind of Catholicism to New Mexico. New Mexico was used to that ancient Spanish Catholicism that was brought through Mexico to New Mexico. And then Lamy, he brings a different kind of Catholicism that's French. He's used to nice, beautiful French churches made out of stone with stained glass windows. He sees that all over his country of France. He comes to the East Coast United States and sees similar churches in places like Cincinnati and St. Louis. And then, lo and behold, they send him to New Mexico. And when he gets here, he sees a bunch of mud churches, adobe, okay? A very poor area compared to the rest of the Spanish Empire. And all indications is he doesn't really like it all that much. Okay?
That's pretty unlikely.
And the people here didn't like him all that much. In fact, they greeted him by saying, "Do you got proof that you're our bishop? Because you're supposed to get it from Durango." Do you know how far Durango is? It's about, what, 800 miles from here? So he got on a donkey, and one of the New Mexico priests got with him, and he went down to Durango, and a year later showed up with, I'm the new bishop here. And so it was a stressful start. He looked at the local priests like Father Martinez, the famous priest of Taos, who was educated by Jesuits in Durango, and he was a very intelligent man, and the local priests were used to doing things the way they were doing them under Mexico, and then some argue that Lamy brought a certain strain of Jansenism, a very puritanical, strict form of Catholicism, and they clashed. Never mind that there are a bunch of lay people walking around whipping themselves like it's medieval times, you know, it's like, let's party like it's 12.99, you know what I mean? And he was a little bit freaked out by that. So you have these factions forming. You have the local priests, then you have Lamy, who condemned the penitentes. He condemned them. And so you have this back and forth, and add to it that Father Martinez was an advocate of the penitentes. He was a bit of an agitator too. You know, I want to be fair. I find them both fascinating. At one point, what really gets going with Martinez and Lamy is that Lamy puts out his Christmas pastoral, I think it's 1857 or something like that, where he says, if you don't tithe, we're going to withhold the sacraments from you. And then Martinez jumps in and says, canon law, you can't do that. You can't do that. Oh, and they go at it. Martinez is supposedly excommunicated by Lamy. I say supposedly because nobody can find the documents in Rome or New Mexico. We're starting to wonder if it was a verbal excommunication. It's so unclear. But let's just say that over the centuries, the penitentes went underground. You can see the penitente moradas. The famous one is the one at Abiquiu. They had them on my dad's cousin's land up in Mora. We used to go into it. My dad's uncle, Ignacio Trujillo, was the hermano mayor. But right around the 70s with Archbishop Sanchez through to Archbishop Michael Sheehan, the penitentes have been essentially accepted as part of the Catholic landscape here in New Mexico. But it was a back and forth because Lamy, to be fair, I want to be fair to Lamy. He came here and he literally looked at us and said, these people are barely Christian anymore. They're barely Christian, we need to re-Christianize. So he brought the Sisters of Loreto in, and those Carmelite nuns are brought in. He does a lot of things, but one sure sign Lamy left his mark. If you go to Old Town Albuquerque or to some of these churches, it's an old adobe church with white wooden spires that he had stuck on there to say, I will make you France. I will make you France. So that's indicative of that conflict. So, did that answer the question?
Mm-hmm.
I hope. Okay. Yes.
Two-part question. Are you familiar with the Byzantine Discalced Carmelites?
I'm not.
Okay. Well, then I guess I'll defer to you, Father.
I'll defer to you, Father.
And we'll go back and forth. What do you think resonated so much with the Eastern Church and the Discalced Carmelites, this rich tradition that comes from Spain that has taken root in the East?
Well, the mysticism, the spirit, because it's basically theosis. What the East calls theosis, or deification, is really what the Carmelites strive for. If you go to talk to a Carmelite nun through the grill, they sound very Eastern Christian, and they're very big in Bulgaria, which is all Eastern Christian. They have a big monastery in Sofia, the capital of Discalced Carmelites, so that are Byzantine, right? And in India too, the Carmelites are very popular in India. I think that the mystical trend that is in native Indian religion, people really responded when the Carmelites came. Both the friars and the nuns, they're very, very popular in the Eastern countries.
Well, you're looking at least New Mexico, and if I think about rural Spain in the 1500s, you're looking at, and a lot of times, at a folk Catholicism. You see what I'm saying? That whole idea that God is right there with you. You're intimately connected to Christ's suffering, and Christ knows exactly what it means to be human, with all its failings and happiness. And I think that can sometimes clash with institutional church, where you have rules and theology and inquisition. A lot of these areas became hotbed for witchcraft beliefs, superstition, and of course esoteric Catholic beliefs. And I think mysticism, to a level, falls into those categories because it is so intimate. It has that sensual quality that is sometimes can make people suspicious.
Cool.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so like LeMay, his kind of issue that you were kind of commenting on with Mexico Catholicism. Do you think that at all can be said, like you were mentioning, like the mysticism, things like witchcraft, things like that? Can that be also said to be kind of maybe the fusion of the influence with Catholicism, and not even, maybe not so much from Spain, but with the Native American beliefs that were already here?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course, but we are a mestizo culture. We're part Spanish, we're part Mexican, we're definitely part Native American.
You're Irish too.
And Irish, well, later Irish, but yes, Irish too. We've got it all, man.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's a mix, and when you add the Pueblos, which are a very strong influence here, their cultures are lively and vibrant, and you add in the 1700s, the mid-1700s, the Genizaros in Abiquiu, San Miguel del Vado, later on, Belen. The Genizaros are Plains Indians that are brought in as servants, and then they're Hispanicized and Catholicized, but they still have their native belief systems that are kind of syncretized with Catholicism, and it boils over in Abiquiu in the 1760s when there's an outbreak of sorcery up there, And it's amazing. That's my master's thesis. It was on that case, an Inquisition case.
Really?
Oh yeah, it's quite fascinating, but it's everything you're saying. You look at it, there's like, wow, there's Spanish Catholicism, there's Spanish folk religion, there's Spanish witch beliefs, there's possibly Navajo witch beliefs in there, and there's definitely social rebellion against the priest in the town.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
And is that something specific to here? Because I mean, like, did the Irish, as an example, just have the benefit of becoming Catholic farther back? I mean, I know I've heard of talk of like the Celtic Church and there being, you know, kind of differences with the kind of Catholicism that exists in Ireland. But I mean, I'm just saying, like in other parts of the world that that became Catholic, there doesn't seem to be this kind of conflict between the church and maybe the kind of native beliefs that were already there.
Maybe. I mean, if you go to South America, I think you could find similar things. You could find similar things in Mexico and Africa. The beauty of the Catholic Church is its ability to stay Catholic and yet absorb and be absorbed by local cultures. If you go back to the First Council of Jerusalem, one of the first things that happens to the early church out of the gate is encountering the pagan Greeks, right? And everything's going well when Paul is preaching and saying, you get to die and go to heaven, and everybody goes, not just rich people. And they're all like, well, this is good. I can get on board for this. But then he says, you can't eat pig anymore, and you got to get circumcised. And they're like, whoa, I don't know about that. We've been eating pigs all the time, and you're not going to do that to me. Circumcision. So those are the old Jewish laws that the church eventually says, well, we're going to have to bend these things. So, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So out of the gate, you have that mix of pagan Greek and the early church. And you have that happening, and it's an uneasy relationship sometimes. I mean, these priests, let's be honest, some of these Franciscans were taking those Kachina dolls and throwing them into fires and burning them because they said this is demonic. In their eyes it was. But even our santos, that the santeros, the saint makers, would carve, they'd use the same wood that the Kachinas were carved with, and they'd use the same paints the Indians used to paint their Kachinas, to paint their saints. So you have that kind of like a dance going back and forth. And the Irish are here by the 18... Irish people coming to the United States were not treated very nicely in the 1800s. And one of my favorite stories is they would tell the Irish in the East Coast, if you go fight in the Mexican War with Mexico, you can become citizens like that. So a group of Irishmen came to the border here and were fighting the Mexicans. Yes, and when they found out they were fighting Catholics, they said, we're going to the other side. And of course the Americans said, traitors, and the Mexicans said, amigos, héroes, the heroes, So history can be quite interesting at times. He knows the San Patricios, that's cool. Thank you very much for having me.